Rancher saved an Apache girl and her baby. The next day her father came with a proposal no one expected.
The prairie lay hushed beneath a copper sky, its grasses bending in long sighs as if the land itself remembered old sorrows. Ethan Cole stood by the sagging fence of his meager ranch, his calloused hands steadying a post that leaned with age. He had spent half his years on soil that refused to make him rich, and though his neighbors sometimes pitied him, they did not know the quiet ache of his evenings, the silence of a table set for one, the hearth burning for no one but himself. He often thought the wind spoke to him, not with comfort, but with reminders that he belonged to no one, and no one belonged to him. That night, however, the wind carried something more than loneliness. It carried a cry. At first he thought it was the cry of a coyote pup, high and frail in the distance, but then it came again, softer, trembling, too human to mistake. Ethan lifted his head, squinting toward the shadows gathering along the cottonwoods near the creek. The cry was not alone. He heard men's laughter, rough and mocking, laced with cruelty. His jaw tightened. He had learned long ago that a man could choose to look away from suffering, but looking away only grew heavier in the dark of one's mind. He set down the hammer and reached for the rifle propped against the fence. His boots pressed quiet over the grass as he walked into the growing dusk. By the creek, where the last light shivered against the water, he found them. Two men stood jeering, their voices dripping malice. Between them, a young woman clutched a bundle against her chest, a child, no more than a year old, whose thin wail pierced the air like a blade. The woman's dress was torn at the shoulder, the fabric still graceful despite its wear, its folds carrying a dignity that even fear could not erase. Her dark hair spilled loose down her back, strands catching the fading light like strands of obsidian. Her eyes, wide and sharp, darted between her tormentors, yet never faltered from holding the child closer to her body. Ethan did not know her name then, but he felt a recognition, as if she belonged to the land itself, untamed and proud. The men laughed louder, one reaching for her arm, jerking her roughly. The baby cried harder. Ethan's finger brushed the trigger of his rifle before he could think. Enough. The word left his lips low but firm, riding the air like the crack of a whip. The outlaws turned, their sneers shifting to irritation. They were men who measured worth in fear, and seeing Ethan standing calm with a rifle unsettled them more than if he'd come shouting. "Well, look who's come wandering out of his hole," one spat. The poor rancher with nothing to lose. Ethan said nothing. He held their gaze, the rifle angled steady, though his heart beat fast enough to break his chest. The silence stretched, broken only by the baby's whimper. Then one of the men, drunk with cruelty or perhaps liquor, took a step closer, hand twitching at his pistol. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The shot rang sharp, splitting the quiet evening in two. Smoke curled from Ethan's barrel, and the outlaw stumbled, dropping to his knees with a howl. His companion froze pale, then cursed and scrambled for the brush, vanishing into the dark with footsteps fading fast. The wounded man clutched his leg, but the sight of Ethan reloading was enough to send him limping after his partner, leaving the woman and child trembling in the creek's shadow. For a long moment, the prairie seemed to hold its breath. Ethan lowered the rifle, his shoulders heavy, his chest aching with the weight of what he'd just done. Then his eyes met hers. She stared at him with equal parts fear and question, her lips pressed tight, as if she might refuse gratitude. The baby, however, reached a tiny hand toward him, its small fingers curling in the air. "You're safe," Ethan said, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. He did not know whether she understood, but the gentleness mattered more than the words. The woman hesitated, then adjusted the child in her arms and stepped forward. Ethan saw the lines of exhaustion etched deep into her face. How many nights had she walked, hungry and hunted, yet still upright for the child she carried? Pride stood beside her like a sentinel, but weariness bent her shoulders. He nodded toward his cabin, faint in the distance beyond the hill. "You can rest there," he said. For a heartbeat, he thought she might refuse. Her lips parted, as if she meant to argue, but the baby whimpered again, and her eyes softened with surrender. She followed him, cautious, steps measured, as though she feared even kindness might be a trap. Ethan walked ahead slowly, giving her space to keep her pride intact. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of smoke and pine. The walls were rough, the furniture plain, just a table, 2 chairs, and a small cot pushed against the wall. Ethan lit a lantern, the glow spilling warmth into the room. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, holding her child as though she could not yet trust the roof above her head. "You can sit," Ethan offered, pulling out a chair. She lowered herself carefully, the child still nestled against her. Her eyes swept the room, not with disdain, but with a searching look, as though she needed to understand what kind of man lived here. Ethan busied himself with the pot on the stove, pouring hot water over dried beans. It was all he had to give. He set a bowl before her without ceremony, then placed bread beside it. For a moment, she did not move. Her pride warred with her hunger. Then the child shifted, reaching toward the bread with a soft, curious sound. She broke a piece, offered it to the baby, and only after he chewed did she take a bite herself. Ethan turned away, giving her the grace of privacy. He sat across the table, eating in silence. The fire crackled low. The baby's laughter broke the heaviness, startling them both. The little boy had discovered the edge of the table and slapped it with delight, crumbs on his chin. Ethan found himself smiling despite the tightness in his chest. The woman's gaze lifted, meeting his for the first time with something that was not only guardedness, but faint, weary thanks. He did not ask her name. Names felt too heavy, too binding, and the night had already given them more than either expected. Instead, he let the silence speak, filled with small sounds, the baby's coos, the fire's murmur, the whisper of the wind against the door. When at last the child slept, the woman laid him gently on the cot. She did not take the bed for herself, but curled against the floor near the fire, wrapping her shawl close. Ethan frowned, wanting to offer his own bed, but he knew she would not accept. Pride kept her on the floor, dignity in her own choice. He spread a blanket near her, saying nothing. Sleep did not come easily to him. He lay on his bed, staring at the low ceiling, listening to the baby's soft breaths and the faint rustle as the woman shifted near the fire. He wondered what roads had brought her here, who had abandoned her to such dangers, and why the sight of her stirred something he thought long buried. He told himself she would be gone by morning, yet his heart beat differently in his chest, as though already fearing her absence. Dawn arrived with pale light spilling over the hills. Ethan rose quietly, stepping outside to fetch water. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with fragile pink. When he returned, she was already awake, holding the child close as if ready to leave. Her eyes met his steady, almost defiant, though her mouth trembled as if caught between gratitude and farewell. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice carried the lilt of her people, words measured like song. Ethan nodded. "Safe roads." She adjusted the child, as though preparing to step into the day. But then a new sound cut across the morning, the thunder of hooves, heavy and insistent, rolling closer with each heartbeat. Ethan's hand went to his rifle, but when he looked to the rise beyond the cabin, he saw not bandits but riders dressed in leather and beads, faces painted with solemn lines. At their head rode a tall man with stern features carved deep as canyon stone. His hair, streaked with gray, fell over his shoulders, and his eyes burned with a fire that seemed older than the hills themselves. The woman's breath caught. She held the child tighter, her eyes fixed on the leader of the riders. Ethan looked between them, the weight of realization pressing in. The man reined his horse sharply, gaze falling to Ethan like a blade. His voice, low and steady, carried across the yard. "You sheltered my daughter." The words fell heavy, neither praise nor accusation, but something more complex, an opening to a fate Ethan had not expected. And in that still morning air, as the child stirred and the woman lowered her gaze, Ethan felt the ground beneath him shift, as though the night's rescue had been but the first step into a story far greater than his own. The horses circled the cabin like shadows against the morning sun, their breath steaming in the cool air, their riders silent but watchful. Ethan felt the weight of their eyes upon him, as if each gaze measured the man who had dared to stand beside one of their own. The woman at his side, her name still unspoken between them, clutched her child with trembling strength, her dark eyes cast down. Yet even in her silence, Ethan sensed the storm that trembled beneath her stillness. The older man at the head of the riders dismounted with deliberate calm. His boots pressed the earth with authority, and when his hand touched the reins, even the horse seemed to bow. The man's face was strong with lines carved by sun and grief. His eyes held no hesitation as they swept across Ethan, the cabin, and finally the daughter who had returned from a night with a stranger. His voice came like stone rolling through a canyon. "You took her in," he said. The words were not a question nor praise. They were judgment wrapped in acknowledgement. Ethan did not flinch beneath them. He stood with rifle lowered, his voice steady though his heart pressed against his ribs. "She needed shelter," Ethan answered. "Any man would have done the same." The older man's eyes narrowed. Not every man would face bullets for a woman not his own. Silence stretched. The woman shifted, as though words pressed upon her lips, but she held them in, clutching the child tighter. The baby stirred, fussing against the tension that thickened the air. The older man took a step forward. "I am Nayati," he said, "chief to those you see, father to the woman you guarded through the night." His voice lowered, and with it came a weight that pressed against Ethan's chest. "You did more than offer kindness. You stood between her and dishonor. That debt does not fade with dawn." Ethan's brow furrowed, the meaning heavy though not yet clear. "I ask for no debt." "And yet you hold it," Nayati replied. His gaze shifted to the woman, then back to Ethan. "She carries not only herself, but a child, my grandson. Without a name to stand beside her, men of little honor circle her as wolves circle a fawn. You stopped them once. Who will stop them again when the night grows long?" The woman's head bowed, shame and pride warring upon her face. Ethan felt the truth of her father's words. The world was cruel to women alone, crueler still to one caught between two peoples. He wanted to look away, but her eyes lifted then, catching his in a moment that bound him in place. "What are you asking of me?" Ethan said quietly, though he already knew. Nayati's voice carried no softness. "I ask nothing. I tell you, you will take her as wife." The words struck like thunder, leaving the air hollow after their echo. Ethan stood still, as if the ground had shifted beneath his boots. Marriage was not a cloak easily donned. It was a vow, a bond, a weight heavier than soil or stone. He saw his own cabin, bare and poor, offering little more than walls against the wind. He saw himself, a man with no wealth, no family, no name that carried weight. What right had he to bind her life to his? "I am no man for her," he said at last, his voice rough. "I can barely feed myself. I can offer her no standing, no place of honor. She deserves more. She deserves protection," Nayati said, unmoved. "Honor is not measured in coin or cattle. It is measured in what a man is willing to bleed for." The baby whimpered. The woman, Ayana, her name whispered by one of the riders behind, shifted him against her shoulder. The sound of her name settled in Ethan like an ember, glowing in the hollow of his chest. "Ayana." He repeated it silently, tasting its shape like something both fragile and strong. Her voice, soft but steady, broke through the stillness. "Father." Nayati's sternness wavered for the first time as he looked at her. Her eyes glistened, not with fear, but with something Ethan could not name. She did not beg nor plead. Instead, she lowered her head in acknowledgment of her father's decree. The silence that followed bound them all in its inevitability. Days passed in a strange rhythm, the ranch no longer silent, but filled with the sound of small movements, the baby's cooing, Ayana's footsteps as she swept the floor or mended worn cloth, Ethan's boots pacing outside as he repaired fences and patched the roof. The proposal, no, the decree, hung between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Ethan could feel it in the way her eyes brushed his when she handed him bread, in the way the baby reached for his fingers as though they had always belonged there. He told himself it was duty, nothing more. He told himself he would endure the arrangement until the chief took his daughter back, until another solution came. But as the days stretched, he began to notice the way light touched her face when she bent over her child, or the quiet determination with which she carried every burden without complaint. One evening, as the sun slipped gold across the prairie, Ethan worked on the roof. His hands were blistered, his shirt clung with sweat, but he glanced down and saw Ayana at the cabin's edge, sewing a torn sleeve. The baby gurgled beside her, clutching a wooden spoon, as though it were a prize. Ayana's fingers moved with patient grace, each stitch neat and sure. It struck Ethan then, this was not a woman merely surviving. This was a woman rebuilding. And without intending, he had become part of that rebuilding. The peace did not last. It was near midnight when the dogs barked, their growls sharp against the wind. Ethan rose from his bed, hand reaching for his rifle, before he even heard the hoofbeats. He stepped outside, the cold air cutting his lungs. Dark figures rode fast from the east, shadows against the moon, gun barrels catching silver light. Outlaws, their rage still smoldering from the night, he had driven them off. Ethan shouted for Ayana to stay inside, his voice urgent. She clutched her child, eyes wide with the terror of recognition. But Nayati and two of his men had not ridden far. They emerged from the trees like ghosts, weapons ready, faces painted with grim resolve. The outlaws circled, firing shots into the air, shouting curses. Ethan felt the old fear crawl into his veins, but beside it came something stronger, the refusal to surrender what had been entrusted to him. He raised his rifle, breath steady, heart thundering not only for his own life, but for the woman and child inside the cabin. Gunfire cracked the night. Sparks burst from wood as bullets struck the walls. Ethan fired back, the recoil jarring through his arms, but he stood firm. One outlaw fell from his horse, rolling into the dirt. The others pressed harder, wild and reckless, spurred by anger. Nayati fought with a fierceness that seemed born from generations, his tomahawk flashing in the moonlight, his rifle crackling like thunder. Yet Ethan did not look to the chief for strength. His eyes searched for Ayanna, who stood just inside the doorway, her child against her chest, her gaze locked on him with fear and something deeper, something that demanded he survive. A bullet grazed Ethan's arm, tearing flesh, but he did not falter. Pain burned, yet his body moved with a resolve he had never known. Each shot he fired was not for land or pride, but for the fragile trust that had begun to bloom in the quiet days they had shared. At last the outlaws broke, scattering into the night, their cries fading into the distance. Smoke hung heavy over the cabin, the scent of gunpowder sharp in the air. Ethan lowered his rifle, his breath ragged, blood soaking his sleeve. The silence that followed was deafening. Ayanna stepped forward, her face pale but unyielding. She reached for his wounded arm with trembling hands, her touch gentle yet sure. Ethan's breath caught, not from pain but from the weight of her nearness. For the first time, her eyes met his without fear, and in them he saw something that steadied him more than any weapon, recognition. Nayati approached, his expression unreadable. He looked at Ethan, then at his daughter, then at the child who reached out toward Ethan as though the battle had already been decided. Slowly, the chief nodded, his voice quiet yet carrying the strength of verdict. You have proven more than once. My daughter is not dishonored in your home. She is kept safe. His gaze softened almost imperceptibly. If she chooses you, I will not stand against it. The words hung like a release in the air, heavy and liberating. Ethan looked to Ayanna, uncertain. Her eyes glistened, lips parting with a breath she had long held. She did not speak many words, but the quiet nod she gave was more binding than any vow. The prairie night stretched vast above them, stars burning fierce and endless. In that silence, Ethan felt the shape of something new forming, a life no longer haunted by solitude, a home no longer hollow. The cabin, once only his, now held more than walls and fire. It held the fragile beginnings of a family. And though the battles of tomorrow waited beyond the horizon, Ethan understood that this night had sealed something unshakable. Love, he realized, did not come with thunder. It came in the steady courage to stay when the world urged you to leave. It came in the small mercies, in the hands that reached for you after the smoke cleared, in the trust that lingered even when silence held the air. The land stretched endless, wild and unyielding, yet for the first time, Ethan did not feel alone upon it. Ayanna stood beside him, her child between them, and her father watching with a quiet acceptance that spoke louder than words. The prairie whispered of storms yet to come, of trials not yet faced. But for that moment, beneath the weight of stars, there was shelter, and there was the promise of something stronger than survival. There was the beginning of home.
If this tale touched your heart, ride along with us. Subscribe and never miss the next story under the Western Stars.